Anyone who's travelled on the London Underground will either heard the sign, heard the announcements, or seen the signs telling them to mind the gap. Of course, what they're talking about is the gap between the train and the platform edge. What I'm talking about here is the gap exists between reality and our perceptions and interpretations of it, and also the gap that exists between other people and how we perceive and experience them. Essentially, it's all to do with cognitive biases and our personal narrative. Let me explain what I mean. Our brain's main purpose, or prime directive as I call it, is survival. It achieves this by learning from our past experiences and collecting these together to develop explanations about causality. It's a little bit like this, because this starts from birth. So, for example, baby has this horrible feeling, they cry, mama comes and feeds them, and everything's okay again. Or baby cries because they have this other feeling they don't like, mama comes and changes them, and everything is okay again. Over time, and with repetition, this tells us that if we feel distress, someone will come to us, and it gives us a sense of security. It also tells us that other people and the world are reliable and good, and it also says that we are worth responding to. But what about those situations when nobody comes, or when nobody comes, people only come intermittently? What does baby learn from that? Well, maybe they learn that other people are unreliable and untrustworthy, and that nobody's really interested in how they feel. And what about those situations where the people who are supposed to care for baby hurt them or neglect them? What do they learn from that? Well, maybe they learn they have no value, that other people will hurt them. Or maybe some of them even learn to disconnect from their emotions so that it doesn't hurt so much. As we're growing up, people say things about us, people react to us in different ways, and there are all these random experiences around us that we call life. And what happens is that we build them together to start to develop causal explanations of this happens and this happens, and we start to weave these together in a narrative, a personal life narrative that tells us who we are, who other people are, what we can expect of ourselves and the world in the general. In transactional analysis, we call this a life script. Now, this life script or narrative connects together all of our autobiographical memories and our interpretations and recollections of them, together with our current experience, our goals, and our expectations of the future. We use it to give ourselves a sense of identity. It tells us who we are, how we came to be who we are, and what we can become. Now, the only problem with this is that this narrative was developed by a child's logic and thinking capacity, which of course is incomplete and not necessarily logical, but it forms the very foundation of our narrative, and everything that happens from it builds from there. Now, of course, because we can only know the world through our own experiencing, what this does is this creates in all of us a kind of egocentric bias. We're the center of our own universes. Of course we are. But what we forget is that we're not the center of other people's universes. They are. And that what we seem to forget also is that our way of viewing things makes sense to us, but that other people have a unique perspective on the world, which is based on their experiences, which are equally valid. These narratives, as we build up over time, they can become quite limiting. And most people develop one that's limiting, a little bit negative, a little bit pessimistic. And when they come to therapists like myself, they sit down and they tell us their story. We listen carefully to their story, and we start to hear all of the threads and recurring themes that run throughout it. We also notice little biases and inconsistencies and gaps in the logic. We also start to pay attention to how they process information and what information they remember and how they remember it. We start to notice all these little distortions. Now, our personal narrative has a really strong relationship to our mental health. There's an enormous amount of evidence now that supports this. And arguably, one of the most important tasks in psychotherapy is the reauthoring of a negative limiting narrative into one that's more flexible, open, optimistic, and creative. One of the ways that our narrative is supported and reinforced is through a series of cognitive biases, which we all have to some extent. Now, these biases create a kind of gap or space between reality and us, between reality and how we perceive it. Now, there are 7 of these cognitive biases that I think are particularly problematic and that I think get in the way of our mental health and our relationships. So I'm going to just talk you through these and give you a few little tips on what I think you can do that will stop you falling into the gap quite so often, or maybe if you do fall into the gap, you won't fall quite so deep so you can climb out quicker, okay? The first one of these is confirmation bias. Now, this is where we seek out, pay attention to, notice and recall information that supports our views, and where we discount or ignore anything that contradicts it. Now, we see examples of this all over social media every day, where people post things that back up their views and where they ignore or argue against things that disagree with them. Now, this is a particularly difficult bias because, of course, we all want to be right and we don't want to be wrong. So one of the ways we have to address this is by accepting that maybe our way of viewing things is not the only way of viewing things. Another thing that my tip for dealing with this is to take a step back. To take a step back from yourself and start to develop the capacity for self-observation. Start to learn to recognize the implicit narrative that you're viewing the world through. Also, it can be quite useful to find out information that both supports your point of view but also challenges it. And instead of just dismissing it, read it in a kind of open-minded and balanced manner and try to see that there's something valid in both perspectives. Number 2, naive realism. Now, with naive realism, this refers to how our own thought process, our conclusions, our views on things already make perfect sense to us. Well, of course they do. We thought of it. We know all the steps behind it. But what we forget with this is that our perspective is only our perspective and that other people have created theirs, which, as I've already said, are inevitably different to our own, and that their perspective is different. But the trouble with this is because our views are self-evidently rational, we think that this should be rational to everybody else as well, and that anybody who disagrees with us is either wrong or stupid. Yeah, you know what this one's like, don't you? So my tip for dealing with this is to, first of all, accept that life and our perceptions of it are completely subjective, and that our perspective is only one perspective. Other people's perspectives are just as valid as yours. Now, one thing where this can come quite in handy is, say, if you're arguing with your partner about different ways that you remember an event. So you've got different views on what actually happened, or you're arguing, this has happened, no, you're wrong, it happened like this. Instead, it's probably more useful to remember that both of you are only remembering it from your own point of view and your own perspective, and that each of us have memories which are inaccurate, which are incomplete, and of course, which are distorted to fit our view of things. But also, the other person is doing exactly the same. So maybe another way of looking at it is that we're both right and we're both wrong, depending on which way you view it. Number 3, fundamental attribution error. This is another one that's really problematic in relationship, and I think is the cause of many fights that couples get into. So with fundamental attribution error, it's where we attribute a layer of meaning or intention behind other people's actions or inactions. It's like, for example, if we're late for dinner. If I'm late for dinner, it's because of various reasons. The clean laundry needed putting away. The kids were being a handful. My friend who I haven't spoken to for 2 years called. Of course I needed to speak to them. The traffic was terrible. There was nowhere to park. You get this? But if you're late for dinner, it's because you don't care about me. So, and then if you're the other person, I'm sitting here feeling like an innocent victim and angry with you because you don't respect me. And if you're the other person, you feel misunderstood and misrepresented, and so it all goes on in this terrible circle. My tip for this is to recognize when you're adding a layer of meaning about other people's reasons or intentions, catch yourself and stop and realize that you don't actually know for sure what somebody else means or intends by something. And remind yourself that there is a really good chance that you're probably wrong. In fact, you could even ask them, if you want, what their intentions were, what their meanings were, but you have to be prepared to accept their answer, even if it is very, very different to what you expect it to be. Number 4, the spotlight effect. Now, do you remember how I said we are the center of our own universes? The spotlight effect is a really, really good example of this. In fact, probably the perfect example of this is when we walk into a busy room, for example, a restaurant, and people turn, and we think that they're looking at us, and they're judging us, or mocking us in some way. Now, of course, the reality is that they're not really looking at you because they're too busy thinking about themselves. I'm sorry, princess, you ain't that special. You know, I hate to break it to you. Now, what we have to remember as well is that other people also have the egocentric bias where they think they're the center of the universe. So if you're looking, they think that you're looking at them, not the other way around. And do you know what? If they do look, they'll glance, they probably didn't even notice, and if they did, they'll probably forget. So remember that. They're probably not looking, they're probably too busy thinking about themselves. The next one, the transparency illusion. This is where we think that our thoughts, our feelings, our wishes and intentions are completely obvious to everyone else. It's almost like part of us believes that other people can see how we feel inside. Now, the transparency illusion is most prominent when it comes to shame and anxiety. These are two of the most terrible emotions that we can feel. So if we feel ashamed, that we imagine that other people can see how ashamed we feel. Not only that, we kind of believe that they know why we feel ashamed and what terrible thing it is that we imagine that we've done. Similarly with anxiety, when we feel anxious, we feel really self-conscious and we think that everybody can see how afraid we are. Now, of course, with this is not true. People can't see what's going on for you. And so my tip for dealing with this is to remember you haven't got a glass head. People can't see inside of you. They can't see what you're feeling. And what's going on for you is really not as obvious to anyone else as you might think it is. State-dependent memory. State-dependent memory has both good and sides to it, bad sides to it. So it's where our emotions cloud our memories, and our emotional state at any one time will link back, and it will make accessible all memories of where we felt the same way in the past. So, for example, if you're having a fight with your partner because they've disappointed you, you're going to remember all of those other times that they disappointed you, and you might even mention them when you're having a fight. But it also works to our advantage sometimes. So if you've got an old friend who you haven't seen for a while, and you're having one of those lovely catch-ups, you know, where it starts to get more and more hilarious as you're remembering all the crazy things you've done together, that's the nice side of state-dependent memory. The negative side of it that doesn't work so well for us is when we start remembering all this other stuff and we sink deeper and deeper into this pain that we're feeling. So my tip for this is to remember that when you're upset, angry, disappointed, or frustrated, and you start to think about other times, is catch yourself, stop you, and just take a step back from that moment and stop fueling how you're feeling with all these distressing memories. And lastly, I want to talk to you about negativity bias. Now, we are primed neurologically to look out for negative information. Now, this tendency makes a lot of sense when we think back to our ancestors on the savannah. The ones that remembered the negative information, such as about predators or poisonous berries, or the slight rippling in the grass that told us a snake was approaching, these were the ones who survived. The trouble with negativity bias is it doesn't work so well in our modern life. In fact, it contributes massively to our bad moods, our gloomy outlooks, and also it's a major contributor towards depression and anxiety. In fact, one of the main features of anxiety is overestimating threat and underestimating our ability to cope, which is all about negativity bias. Now, negativity bias, out of all of them, is particularly persistent. And every time you're being negative, you have to realize it, take a step back, catch yourself, and shift yourself consciously onto a more optimistic way of viewing things. I have a few other tips for dealing with this. First of all, be charitable and try to see the good in people instead of looking for the worst. The second one is just to recognize that most people are actually good and honest. And lastly, just pay attention to all of the many good things that happen in day-to-day life. The many, many good things, big things, small things. Really enjoy them, turn up the volume on them, and make a mental note to enjoy them and remember them later. You could, if you wanted, write them all down in a writing pad. You could put them on slips of paper that you put in a cookie jar, or you could make a little note of them on a notes app on your phone so that you can read back through them on a bad day to remind you that there is plenty of good in the world. Thank you.